Hi, and welcome to a special press clips edition of Newsmakers. I'm Jerry Roberts. It is Friday, July 22nd, and I am extremely pleased to welcome back Kelsey Brugger to Newsmakers. She's been a long time. Kelsey, of course, was one of the original members of our panel back when she worked for the Santa Barbara Independent. She went off to cover politics in Washington in 2018, and since has been employed by E&E.com, Energy and Environment. She covers climate change, the politics of climate change. Kelsey Brugger, as I live and breathe, there you are in Washington. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So let's start with talk about what your beat is in Washington and what E&E is a little bit.
Sure, yeah. So E&E News is based here in D.C. We actually have reporters all over the country, though, covering environmental issues. There's about 70 of us, so we get really kind of in the weeds on some of this. We are now owned by Politico, so we're out there in their office, and my beat is it's kind of I've kind of like jumped around a little bit, but right now I'm sort of focusing on the politics of the Biden administration, the politics of environmental policy. Obviously we've had a really busy few weeks, just with the Supreme Court ruling, with this week with kind of talk about in the aftermath of that, and this week talk of is Biden going to declare a national emergency on climate? So I tend to cover the sort of White House politics and sort of implications
of climate change.
Yeah. And environment and other environmental issues as well.
Okay, all right. Well, let's talk about that Supreme Court issue, that the ruling that you mentioned, West Virginia versus EPA. So apparently the new Supreme Court majority is in the process of rolling back the 20th century. And we've talked on the show about the abortion and gun and prayer in school rulings. We have not talked about this one. What did they rule in West Virginia versus EPA, and why is that important to climate change?
Sure, yeah. So this was a pretty highly anticipated ruling. I think for some people, it wasn't maybe as bad as they were expecting or thinking it could have been, because basically what they did is they restricted the authority of EPA to regulate greenhouse gas emissions, but they didn't strip the authority, essentially. So EPA, still has the authority to regulate greenhouse gas emissions at the source, but not sort of in an overarching way as laid out under the Clean Power Plan, which was an Obama era regulation that never went into effect. So the implications of that are, really broad and remain to be seen in terms of what other regulations, could end up before the Supreme Court, what else they could rule on. I think there have been some environmental groups who have been maybe hesitant to really push the administration to use really robust executive authority, given that ruling, just given, that they could be vulnerable. I mean, there's also an argument to be made that, whatever the Biden administration does on climate, they will be sued. So, that's just the reality of the world we live in. But it's still kind of playing out.
So we had the Clean Power Plan in the Obama administration did not take effect. Then we had the Affordable Clean Energy rule of the Trump administration, which got thrown out, as I recall, at the end of his administration. So was the ruling on the old Clean Power Plan, or was there a Biden administration manifestation of it that they were ruling on?
Yeah, they're still they're still figuring out, like the Biden administration is still working on their plan, how they're going to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. So they've talked about like a piecemeal approach. And I mean, like rulemakings take a really long time, right? So at the beginning of the administration, the Biden administration issued a freeze on everything that, was underway under Trump. There were certain things that were recent that they were able to do in the Congressional Review Act to actually strike. So it's exactly how this plays out is still remains to be seen.
Yeah. Well, not to oversimplify the ruling, but basically one of the things that the justices were saying was, this is a transformational or major thing that you're requiring power plants to use natural gas or other things. But Congress didn't specifically say that's what you should do. But EPA has got what, 7,000 scientists or something like that. And, this is how things have worked. They would, people in Congress don't understand how to do this, but it looks like that's what the court's trying to do, is push it back to Congress. Is
Right.
that a fair take on it?
I think that there's a larger debate about agency discretion, right? And about what, experts at the agency, you hear a lot of people on Capitol Hill saying, just as you said, these agencies have scientists who, know how to, regulate and oversee these industries, which has evolved over time. So, I think, but it's just a very, kind of strict reading of the Clean Air Act. We already have seen, I think it was yesterday, AOC came out with a bill that would specifically allow the Clean Air Act to, promulgate a regulation that's akin to the Clean Power Plan, which is sort of like based on generations shifting, like you said, from coal or fossil fuels to natural gas. So
let me ask you to give us the sort of 25,000 foot view of this. Where are we with climate change in terms of temperature, how much time we have, whether things are moving faster than originally thought by scientists? Just kind of lay that out, would you?
Yeah, so I think, the reports that have come out at the national and international level, continue to be pretty stark. And I think a lot of this ends up getting so confused in like 1.5 degrees Celsius and, cutting 50% of emissions by 2030, which is, some of the Biden targets. So it's like all of these things are really hard, I think, for the average person to figure out, right, exactly what they mean. And, I think the thing with climate change is like I don't think anyone pretends to know exactly. There are different models that like show, worst case scenario and medium bad and less bad, based on emissions reductions that we're able to make, over the coming years. But, we're certainly at a really critical point. And, the Biden administration has, really came out strong and really, issued executive orders that I think progressives and people were really excited about taking, really bold action and setting some of these targets. And, governing takes time. And I think that a lot of activists have been pretty disappointed on climate and, on what they've seen from the Biden administration. So, it's not good, I guess, to answer your question.
Well, they just on the politics of it, the White House was roundly criticized for their kind of very milquetoast reaction to the Roe v. Wade decision. Did they try to be more robust on this? How did they react to this?
Yeah, so I think that some people, people really kind of familiar with like, all this internal dialogue, were saying, to me like that they were hoping that the White House would have a really much more muscular response to the, to the EPA ruling. I think the kind of the news of this week was whether or not the Biden administration is going to declare a climate emergency. And it ends up like all of these things. I think that there's a lot of debate in the environmental community over whether that's a good idea or not. I mean, I don't think that like longtime environmentalists who have been like on the nuts and bolts of this issue for a long time have really been pushing that. I mean, the idea really came from these sort of like novice climate hawks about a decade ago who like read a book from these Australians called Climate No Code Red, and they like started pushing Bernie and Hillary's staff to include it in a platform, which they did. But then of course Hillary lost the presidential election of 2016, so she never declared a climate emergency, even though in her platform, she was going to within the first 100 days apparently. So now they're sort of like, okay, Biden, now's the time. He had a speech. It seems like there's a little bit of, there's still internal debate at the White House about whether or not this is a good idea. Biden was going to went to Massachusetts on Wednesday, and kind of leading up to that, there was a story in the Post that was like, okay, this emergency declaration is coming. But then when he got there, he's like, it is an emergency, but I'm not declaring one yet.
What's the significance of saying it's a climate emergency? How would things?
Yeah. So, I mean, as a practical matter, making a declaration, an emergency declaration, which we've seen recently, right, with baby formula, Trump used it for the border wall to redirect funds, and also for COVID. So it's become kind of like more popular in recent years. But, I think the idea is that on one hand, it's kind of symbolic. It's sort of like, okay, you're federal agencies, this is the top priority. It also could move money around a bit, redirect money to do certain things to spur renewable development. And it could also potentially, enact a ban on crude exports, which was lifted in 2015. Oil lease sales is something else that environmentalists are always pushing to halt. So there's a bunch of actions that could come out of a declaration. But it's like, if you're talking to an environmentalist, they're like, okay, if you declare an emergency, great, but like, what are the actions that are going to come after that? And so like in Canada, I think they declared an emergency one day and then like approved a pipeline the next day. So the environmentalists were like, that was totally useless.
Yeah. Well, the other thing that we heard from Biden himself at the beginning of the administration was this whole of government approach that every agency and every department was going to, have some policy in place that addressed climate. But it seems like this decision, West Virginia versus EPA, kind of puts the kibosh on that, because it's like, well, why would the SEC have anything to do with climate? Is that a correct reading?
Yes and no. I think part of the whole of government approach was like the General Services Administration saying, okay, we have to buy a bunch of electric vehicles and electrify the fleet. So you probably, the most newsworthy thing there was like the Postal Service fleet, right? And like the X number of cars. But then there's also like tons of other cars that the administration owns, and like all the buildings. And I think that, that seems like maybe small in the whole scheme of things, but that can also like be a catalyst for other markets. So I think that, there are things that still can be done. It's not like this ruling, I think it doesn't just
Stop
completely hamstring everything, but yeah, it's still playing out for sure.
How is it different covering the Biden administration from the Trump administration from your perspective?
is interesting. In some ways in some ways there's a lot of similarities. I'll give you an example. Just from as a practical matter, as like, you're a press person working at the White House and I'm calling you. There's certainly this, there's become this norm in Washington that that everything is off the, that they won't say anything on the record. Everything is off the record. Everything is sort of on background. Everything is like from a senior administration official or something. And that's become a norm. I don't know exactly when that started, but I know that that's something that reporters have consistently harped on. Like, you work in the White House, you're a top ranking official, like you're announcing like what's happening for Earth Day. Like, why wouldn't this be on the record? Like, things that are like,
silly.
Yeah. So there are certain things. I mean, I think, in terms of EPA, I think the Biden administration, they certainly made an effort. The Trump EPA, especially at first, and some of this predates me, but was like had a really hostile relationship with the press. Like there were stories about like press people like calling reporters trash and like hanging up on like just like not professional. And I think the Biden administration tried to come in and say, hey, we're the good guys, like, we're going to talk to you and we're going to like, invite you in for like a pen and pad, and like we're the Democrats and we don't, we like the press, right? Because that's kind of the Democratic mantra. So, I mean, from a reporter's perspective, I think, it's a delicate balance, as well as, with regardless of the administration and regardless of the party, of treating it a bit like, being, I don't even know, maybe you could tell me what the right word is, but, treating, you're fair and you're appropriate, but like, you're a reporter, you're still aggressive, you're still asking questions, you're still, you're still treating it like it's, you're not buddies. So it's something that is, difficult, or, you just sort of have to navigate. I mean, I do think the other thing, that's been super weird has been the pandemic, of course, right? Because, being a reporter is like talking to people and getting them to tell you things that they shouldn't, and like sitting down with them. And, some of that you can do on the phone, the phone can be super effective, but a lot of that is like at events that you just chat with people on the side. And so for a long time, those events didn't happen. There's still a lot of them are online. And so, you're watching like a conference, like a virtual conference. I don't think there's usually not news that comes out of a virtual, conference. And so that is a little bit difficult. I mean, obviously that is an overlap of both administrations, but I think, and some of that's coming back because, there are some in-person events, but DC is an in-person town, it relies on like face-to-face contact. So that's restarted, to some extent, to a large extent, depending, but
you're still working at home.
Still working at home most days. I do meet people for coffee often. Like I went to the White House a couple of weeks ago. I was in the office yesterday. So like I do try to make an effort to get out of my apartment, because like I'll just go crazy just sitting in my little writing desk. But yeah, I mean, a lot of reporters are still, at least home half time, which, there's benefits too, right? Like my deadlines are actually at noon. So most of my deadlines are at noon. So it's like, if I'm commuting for 40 minutes, like that's a chunk of the morning, and getting ready and getting out the door. So there are certainly benefits to being super efficient, but it's maybe like the fun piece sometimes is missing. So
yeah, there's that.
Yeah.
Well, people who watch this program know that I am in deep despair and depression about the future of America and the future of our democracy.
Mm.
The midterms are
Why is
coming
that?
up.
Why is that, Jerry?
The midterms are coming up. Everybody expects the Dems to lose control of the House, possibly the Senate as well. Just talk a little bit about what the mood is there and the politics of it, and what people are thinking, with the backdrop of the January 6th committee and so on.
Right. Well, I mean, of course, Republicans are expected to take over the House. It seems to me like Democrats are certainly energized by Roe. They certainly think that maybe that's going to get people to the polls when maybe they had no other reason to before. So I've certainly, talked to people who are holding out hope, but, I think that like the vitriol on the Hill is just like exponentially grown. I mean, it's just, I was talking to a staffer for a Republican office who said, right after the Roe decision, they have like Senate lunches, or they had lunch with like a Democratic staff office, and like the Democratic staffers like weren't going to eat any of the snacks that the Republicans had brought. And it was just like, and she was, wow. And, it was right after Roe. So I was like, well, I mean, that's kind of where we're at. And it kind of gets back to almost that fun piece, right? Where it's like, it's become so intense that it just wasn't, I think for the kind of old timers, that feels just really different. For me, it's like, it's always been kind of intense because I've only been here 4 years, but if you've been covering Washington for decades, you're used to seeing, Republicans and Democrats like getting a beer at Cafe Milano kind of vibe, and like, the pandemic kind of shut that down, and to some extent, and also just the environment and the climate that we're in has made it just a lot of intensity and bitterness.
Yeah, well, one of the things I go off about our representative Salud Carbajal is his sort of fetishization of bipartisanship. I mean, basically, it seems to me, and this is my view. There are two parties. One of them supports democracy, and the other is an authoritarian party at this point. So, well, I'm working across the aisle with the fascists. I mean, it kind of drives me crazy. Do people?
Is he still talking? I mean, I remember him talking about bipartisanship a lot. Is he still the same level? Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah. He's out today doing something. But I mean, is there that feeling in Washington, or is that just kind of a sort of cable news driven narrative that people who indulge in catastrophic thinking, such as myself, have latched on to? What I mean, you used to be the House millennial, so
right. Well, now the Zoomers are now replacing me. Now
I know you're getting squeezed both by Gen X and the Zoomers.
Right. It's okay. Millennials are slowly taking over the world. It's fine. I mean, I think that if you look at Build Back Better and the negotiations around the president's agenda to do climate and social spending fell apart last week. Joe Manchin Thursday night said, no, like inflation's too high, I'm not doing this.
The Democratic senator from
the conservative Democrat who, votes, very conservatively and is from West Virginia, and probably wants to keep his job. But he definitely has torpedoed talks. So, but if you're really in the weeds on some of this stuff, you're saying, okay, well, why can't the White House, why can't Democrats come together with him and Republicans and get something like a methane fee or tax credits for electric vehicles or something that's not spending, right? And like, is that better than nothing? So, I wonder if we're going to kind of see a little bit more of a effort at bipartisanship after like a scorched earth kind of landscape, but I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, with Speaker Kevin McCarthy, I'm sure you're going to have, you'll be switched to the Hunter Biden beat before long. Fortunately, you don't have to worry about that. Well, Kelsey Brugger, thank you so much for taking time to talk with us. We all miss you. Your massive fan club is going to be pleased with me for having you back. And
yeah, thanks for having me. I just wish I could be sort of the butt of the millennial jokes this time. I'll have to come back for Josh can.
No, I got Gen Zers now that
okay, yeah, good.
Yeah,
Good.
Josh.
Well, then I'll have to dunk on them. I'll take on the role.
Students. Well, yeah, we'd love to have you. So every Friday we're doing it. So let me know about your availability and stay safe. You're doing the Lord's work.
Thank
there.
you too.
And we all look forward to speaking with you again.
Thanks, Jerry.